Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. We're actually going to be starting in about 1 minute to give people time to click in if they're coming off of other meetings and their other work. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us all here today. My name is Tina Chalitza, and I'm a policy associate here at the Urban Institute in the Research to Action Lab. And I'm going to be joined today by Mitchell Thorson, who will also present later and will introduce himself further. So before we start off, I just want to say today's session is intended to do a deep dive into our recently released upward mobility data dashboard. And we're going to start the session with a brief overview of the Upward Mobility Initiative and the framework. So a few bits of housekeeping first. As we begin, we'd love for you all to introduce yourselves in the chat so we can get a sense of who has joined us here today. So if you could include your name, your location, where you're calling in from, and the organization that you work for, that would be awesome. We also wanted to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded, so you can revisit it in the future and also share it out to potentially other people as well that may be interested. And lastly, as we walk through the dashboard and its associated resources, we ask that you please either hold your questions until the end, or you can feel free to enter your questions into the chat as they come up for you, and we will then address them, or at least as many of them as we can at the end of the session during our Q&A portion, which we do have. Excellent. So let's go ahead and kick off. So we want to start off by explaining where the upward mobility framework came from and why this dashboard was even developed. So this upward mobility framework builds on a previous effort by the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, which was a convening of cross-disciplinary leaders that was brought together by the Urban Institute with support by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And this group was asking the question, what would it take to dramatically and sustainably increase mobility from poverty? And the aim of this partnership was to gather research and evidence and then coalesce around a shared answer to this question. So the result of the U.S. partnership's work was this three-part definition of mobility from poverty, which identified what it really takes for people to move out of poverty. So what the partnership found is that, economic success is not enough alone. In order to move out of poverty and then stay out of poverty, people also needed to feel that they had power and autonomy in their lives, which is, the ability to make choices and influence actions that are affecting their future. And they had to feel valued in their community, feel like they could contribute to it. So this broader conception of mobility, which we refer to as the three-part definition, that is what drives all of our work here. So now with that context, let's talk about how we developed the upward mobility framework itself. So how did we get from this three-part definition of upward mobility to then a suite of mobility metrics data? So we realized that for communities to become launch pads of upward mobility, they needed some intermediate term measures of the conditions that they could realistically influence within their community. So we essentially sought out to create a relatively comprehensive, but nevertheless concise and accessible set of metrics that local leaders could use to plan strategy and then monitor progress along their journeys to improving upward mobility in their communities. So here is the upward mobility framework. I'll walk through each component of the framework to help you understand what each of these components mean and also how they all fit together. So again, we're going to start with that three-part definition of mobility from poverty that I just showed you in the previous slide that comes from that US partnership. This three-part has the power and autonomy, the economic success, and dignity and belonging that are all the components required to holistically have upward mobility in a community. Also, as a part of the framework, you'll see at the top, we have this banner that weaves across all of the components, because we know that racial equity is necessary for upward mobility, and it's a principle that ties the components of the framework together. Combating persistent racial inequities across all of the pillars, which we're about to dive into, that's really central to achieving realistic and sustainable upward mobility in your community. So this emphasis on racial equity, it's highlighted across all of our elements in our framework. Now, supporting mobility from poverty and these three parts of it are 5 essential pillars. The first pillar on the left here is rewarding work in green. And that is, because jobs and wages constitute the primary source of income and economic security for most people that live in the US today. Then the next pillar is high quality education, the pink one there, because from preschool through post-secondary, education provides a really crucial avenue for realistic economic and social mobility, of course. And then the third pillar is opportunity-rich and inclusive neighborhoods. That's the blue one in the center there, because neighborhoods play a really central role in supporting families' stability and well-being. It gives them access to social and economic opportunities and allows for their children to thrive and succeed realistically. The fourth pillar here is healthy environment and access to good health care. Because good and stable health helps people of all ages surmount life's various challenges. It lets them excel in school, excel on their job. It ensures their family's well-being, and it lets them generally fully participate in their communities, which is very key. And the last pillar here in yellow, that is the responsive and just governance pillar, because governance in a community that is attentive to the needs of all community members and residents, and having community members that are engaged in decision-making, these are the hallmarks of a community that is effectively supporting upward mobility. Now, under each pillar is a set of key predictors of upward mobility. We refer to them in shorthand as predictors. And these evidence-based factors are strongly associated with the likelihood that a community can create conditions to boost the economic and social mobility of its residents, while also narrowing racial and ethnic inequities. And lastly, you'll see we've popped out this metric here on the left side. And this metric that we're isolating is the data point for the predictor that is called jobs paying living wages, right? It falls under that green rewarding work pillar there. And there is at least one metric for each predictor that is a data point used for that predictor. And some of the predictors in the framework actually have 2 metrics. So here we're going to go ahead and zoom in on the predictors of upward mobility, which are on the left side here in green, that fall under that rewarding work pillar. And for each predictor in this pillar, and for the framework overall, of course, but that's what we have illustrated on this slide, the working group selected a specific mobility metric that can be used to compare and monitor, your community's performance on upward mobility over time. So the metrics are a way to take an aspect of each predictor and make it actionable for people doing work on the ground. And the mobility metrics are meant to be this set of short and medium-term measures for all of the 24 predictors in our framework. And we know that no data source is perfect, of course, but we aimed to select metrics that best balance a variety of considerations. So several metrics could reasonably represent the predictors in our framework, but we were charged with choosing a concise number, right? So we developed 7 criteria that we wanted the metrics to meet. The first was that they were valid, right? This meant that we wanted the metric to be well established or accepted in research and policy, and we wanted it to be an accurate measure of the predictor that it was meant to represent in the framework. We also wanted it to be widely available, meaning that it was drawing upon existing and accessible data that existed for communities nationwide. We wanted it to be accessible for everyone in the nation. We also wanted them to be repeated at regular intervals, meaning that, the metric we chose would be routinely measured. which would allow people to effectively monitor and signal the potential effects of policy interventions over time. We also wanted each metric to be geographically mindful. What this means is that the metric would be available at the city or county level, and also at the same time, potentially less sensitive to resident turnover, so that it would be a realistic measure of that community in that area. We wanted it consistent across time and geography, which I think is pretty self-evident, but essentially means that it ensures meaningful tracking and clear comparison within as well as across localities. And lastly, these two, structurally relevant, we wanted these metrics to help identify a systemic condition rather than an individual level outcome, right? Because we want to be targeting the systems that underlie the conditions that we're seeing in our communities. And in terms of being structurally equitable and inclusive of important subgroups, this means that we wanted each metric to help identify structural inequities in the community. So this acknowledges that people experience poverty and upward mobility very differently. We asked of each of the metrics, can it be disaggregated by race or ethnicity, or potentially other characteristics that can help distinguish groups of privilege from those of disadvantage? So with this background now, I'll go ahead and hand this over to Mitchell, who will walk you through the upward mobility data dashboard, which is designed to represent all of the metrics in the framework.
Thanks so much, Tina. And hi, everybody. I'm Mitchell Thorson. I'm a lead data visualization engineer here at Urban Institute, and I'm excited to walk you all through the dashboard today. Okay, so hopefully you can all see the homepage of the dashboard itself right now. So what we're looking at here is the homepage for the Upward Mobility Data Dashboard, which provides the mobility metrics data that Tina just talked about for all counties in the US and for cities with more than 75,000 residents. From this homepage here, there are two main ways that you can jump into the data. You can either search for specific communities using the search bar, or you can explore mobility metrics across the country using what we call the Explore tool. Right at the top of the screen here, we have a button for FAQs, as well as an option to tour this page, which gives new users an overview of how to use this dashboard. Let's click through the tutorial together so we can learn about both ways of jumping into the data. First, you can use the search bar, like I mentioned, to look for mobility metrics for specific cities or counties. You can search for up to 6 cities and counties at a time, and data is available for all counties across the country, and like I said, for any cities with population greater than 75,000 people. If you're curious about what data are available, you can click on the hyperlink here in this pop-up, which will take you to the answer for that on the FAQ. Next, you can select predictors or pillars. You can choose to display data for every predictor, or you can just select a subset of them. By default, all the predictors will be selected when you first enter the dashboard. You can also click on the button that says Read More About Pillars and Predictors if you want to learn more about how we selected the pillars and predictors for the Upward Mobility Framework itself. Once you've selected the communities and the predictors you want to see data for, when you click the search button, you'll be taken to the results page with data cards for each predictor. While the search bar is one way to explore data on the dashboard, the second way is through what we call the Explore widget. This offers both maps and distribution charts to explore data across the country before diving into metrics for specific communities. Start by selecting a predictor that you want to see visualized on the map. You can only view one predictor at a time with the map view. There's a toggle switch here for whether you want to see counties or cities visualized on the map. Right now, we only have the map available for counties, but we're hoping to add a cities view later. With this view, you can also zoom into particular counties to see their metric values by using a search bar. And you can also select which year of data you want to be visualized on the map. Finally, you can also choose to view the data arranged in a distribution chart rather than on a map. The map is better for viewing data geographically and exploring regional trends, while the chart view arranges data by value, so you can see how the metric values vary across all of the communities at once. The chart view will show you the national median for each metric when it's available as well. Okay, Now that we've gone through the tutorial, let's take a closer look at the Explore widget. Like we said before, you can view data for just one predictor at a time here. So let's start off by looking at the access to preschool predictor, which is a part of the high quality education pillar. On the map, you can hover over any county and see the data value for any specific county for the selected metric and year, as you can see what I'm doing now. If we were to zoom in on some place like California, we could see how counties vary across the state on this metric. We see at a glance that counties in California range from the lower end of the scale to the higher end of the scale, and it looks like Los Angeles County falls somewhere near the middle. If I hover over it with my mouse, I can see that the tooltip tells us that LA County had close to 45% of 3- and 4-year-old children enrolled in preschool or nursery school in 2021. Let's search for San Francisco County and see how that compares. It looks like San Francisco County had more than 71% of 3- and 4-year-olds enrolled that same year. If we wanted to know what the figure was for a different year, we can change the year by selecting it from the dropdown here. And if we wanted to learn more about this particular predictor, we could click the Explore this predictor button here, which would take us to a data card for this predictor in this location. We'll talk more about that in a minute. The other option for exploring the mobility metrics across the nation is the chart view. As you can see, this view maps your selected community's value against the values for every other county in the entire US for that metric. You can also navigate over to the Cities tab and see the same chart presented for the cities we have data available for as well. This view also provides you with a national median when we have it available so that you can see whether your community is faring better or worse than the nation as a whole. We can see that San Francisco County here has a higher share of 3- and 4-year-olds enrolled in nursery school or preschool than the median county, and that most counties fall closer to the center of the distribution than San Francisco. In fact, San Francisco is way up here near the top of the scale. These medians are calculated based on county values and are also weighted by population, and you'll see this information if you hover over the national median label here on the chart. If you're curious about how exactly these medians are calculated, you can click on this label, which will take you to the FAQ answer on that topic as well. Okay, now that we've done a bit of exploring on the map and the distribution chart, and we've seen that San Francisco is doing better than LA County when it comes to access to preschool, and that both counties are above the national median. But we probably have a lot more questions. Things like, how is this metric measured? What is the data source? How do San Francisco and LA compare with other similar counties? So let's dive in a little bit deeper and try to get some of those answers as well. We could do that by clicking on the Explore this predictor button, like I mentioned, or we could go back to the top of the page and use the search interface. I'm going to do that now. And I'm going to search for both San Francisco and Los Angeles. Because both of these places are large cities with more than 75,000 residents, you'll see that we have data for both the cities and the counties of Los Angeles and San Francisco. One thing for y'all to keep in mind is that the data are calculated slightly differently for cities than they are for counties. So you can absolutely look at both at the same time, but remember to exercise some caution when comparing across. To keep things simple today, we're just going to look at the counties. Like I mentioned before, all the predictors are selected by default, but we want to just focus on the access to preschool predictor for now. So let me select that. When I click search, that will take us to the results page with a data card for each selected predictor. In this case, just access to preschool. Each of these data cards will offer information for the selected predictor, and it will give you information about the specific metrics used to measure that predictor. Most of these predictors are measured using only one metric, but a handful do have two, in which case you would see more than one chart on the data card. The default view, when we land on this page, is what we call a collapsed view, which shows you just the data points that we saw before on the map, but presented on a chart format, so you can directly compare the two locations selected. To learn even more about this metric, let's expand the card. At the top of the card, you'll see a description that tells you how the metric is defined. So here we learn that this metric reflects enrollment as reported by parents, And if you're curious about why we selected this metric, you can click on the link that says Learn more about the mobility metrics and how they were selected right here. Right above the visualization, you'll get a line of text that tells us exactly what we're looking at. In this case, it tells us that in 2021, in San Francisco County, California, 71.8% of 3 and 4-year-olds were enrolled in nursery school or preschool. And if we click the arrow, we get the same explanation for LA County. We could also look at different years to see how this has changed, and the text will change along with our selections. We can change years with the drop down here. Whenever possible, we can also select all available years to see if there are any trends over time for these locations. Whenever possible, we also try to include data disaggregated by characteristics such as race and ethnicity, gender, age, and more. In this case, we have data disaggregated by race and ethnicity, so let's take a look at that. We can see that there are some disparities by race in both San Francisco and Los Angeles, with Hispanic children experiencing a lower rate of enrollment than any other group that we have data for in both cities. You may also notice that we don't have data available for Black non-Hispanic children in San Francisco. In cases like this one where we aren't able to provide a value, you'll see a data not available note. The FAQ explains that values may be missing due to small sample sizes or the data collection practices of our underlying sources. If you're curious about what the underlying data source is for a metric, you can see that source at the bottom of the expanded card as well. And if you'd like to share any of these statistics with other people, there are a few different options for that. The first is to click the download button below the chart here. This will download an image file with the visualization and some accompanying context about the metric that you can use in your own presentations or reports. The second way to share is to click the share button at the top of the card here. This will generate a link to this specific data card for the Access to Preschool Predictor and for San Francisco and LA counties that you could send to someone else. If you wanted to send someone a link to multiple data cards, you can select all of the predictors that you're interested in on the sidebar here, and you can send them the link directly from your browser's URL bar by copy and pasting from here. Lastly, if you want to download the raw data and use it to create your own charts or do your own analysis, you can export an Excel file by using the Export All Data button here at the top of the page. This will download an Excel file for each location that you've selected, as well as for all of the different metrics that we have for those locations. Okay, now that we've explored one predictor and we've compared between a couple of locations, we might be interested in looking at what upward mobility looks like more holistically across all of the pillars. Let's go ahead and collapse this current card and select all of the predictors and see what that looks like. Okay, now we have 24 cards on this page, which is a lot, but you can kind of scroll through at your own pace and identify anything that looks interesting for you in your community. I'm going to scroll down here to the housing affordability card. Once you've identified that a few predictors that you think are particularly interesting or relevant for your community, you can look at them side by selecting just those predictors. For instance, you might wonder if there's a relationship between this housing affordability pillar and financial security. Let's take a look at just those two predictors. And I can do that by clearing my selection, selecting just housing affordability, and selecting financial security. And now I can see these two predictors lined up. We see that in Los Angeles, there's much less affordable housing available to families with low incomes, and that the share of adults with debt in collections is twice as high. Because we know that the housing crisis is especially stark in California, we might want to compare to some other places as well. If we know what places we want to compare to, I can add them by typing into the search bar here. If you're not sure about which places you'd like to compare to, you can also use the peer selection tool here, which I can expand, and it suggests up to 5 comparison counties for San Francisco. If I wanted the peers for LA instead, I could toggle that here with this dropdown. If you want to know what characteristics the tool is using to recommend these peer counties, you can click on the hyperlink in this little information button here. If not, we can go ahead and add a couple of these suggestions. Scrolling back down and seeing our new comparison charts, it looks like New York and Suffolk County both have relatively less affordable housing than San Francisco, but also a higher share of residents with debt. If you want to investigate the links between the predictor and upward mobility even further, you can expand one of these cards and click the link that says, learn more about this predictor and promising policy interventions right here at the top. This will take you to a page that explains the connections, the evidence linking the predictor with upward mobility, and also a list of local policy interventions that could help you answer the question of what is next. Okay, that brings us mostly to the end of our demo here. And we're going to take any questions later in the call here. But I also want to highlight a few last resources that could help you use the mobility metrics data in this dashboard. First, of course, as mentioned earlier, we have an FAQ page, which you should definitely check out if you have any questions. There's links to it both on the homepage and on the results page. And finally, looking back at the homepage, if I scroll below the Explore tool that we looked at earlier, there's a few more resources that can help you with using the mobility metrics data, examining a specific metric for your community, or obtaining additional data if we can't provide any data for your community, or if you're looking for more context. Okay, that's the end of the demo. And now we're going to give you all a chance to take a look at this. So I would ask that you would take the next 3 minutes to open up the link to the dashboard, which should be in the chat. Select your own communities, select some pure counties, and scroll through the data results page and see if anything stands out to you. And we'll take a minute after that and see what you all found interesting. So go ahead and take 3 minutes, and then we'll come back together in a second here. Okay, just one more minute, and then we'll chat about what you all saw. Okay, so that's been about 3 minutes. Hopefully you all had a chance to look at your local communities and look at some data. So what we'd love to hear is what surprised you. So if anything stood out, please raise your hand and we'll call on you to come off mute and share it, or go ahead and stick it in the chat if you would rather do that. So we'll take 3 minutes to hear from you all. What was interesting? What surprised you?
Hello, Mitchell. This is Dr. Letitia Robertson with Kentucky. So when I was reviewing and perusing the website, I noticed it doesn't provide an opportunity for us to conduct like an equity gap analysis. And it also doesn't have access to like those individuals without a high school equivalency diploma or GED. Is there somewhere else where we could look to get that information?
Thanks so much for the question. That's a great question. Let's add this one to the things that we're gonna circle back to at the end of the call here, but I would love to hold this space for folks to just share any interesting data points. But thank you so much for the question. We can definitely get you an answer there. If nobody else wants to speak up, I'm just going to read a couple of these in the chat. I hear Amber Praxton mentioned that juvenile arrests and homelessness in public schools was shocking. A few folks are running into situations where the data that they're looking for isn't necessarily available, right? And so we also, I would mention and remind you all that in the FAQ, we do talk about what's available, what's not available, and why. So there's definitely information available for those things as well. Laura Yankee mentioned that the ability to see the disparity between available housing for low-income households, very low-income households, and extremely low-income households between peer cities was extremely insightful. And Camille, I'd love to hear from you too.
I'm sorry. So my name is Camille Ferguson. I'm from New York City. I represent the Education Development Center, and I do a lot of work in urban systems in general. So this is really interesting to me. I was just looking at the differences in a few data points between the counties in New York. And just as a lifelong New Yorker, I was surprised at the political participation in Richmond County as opposed to the other counties, but it kind of makes sense in thinking about sort of how more homogeneous that county is. So again, this might not make sense if you're not familiar with the context of the different counties in New York, but that surprised me. But I was really pleased with how quickly I was able to access this data. These are things that we're always thinking about. And in urban systems, we have to go to so many different places to get the data. And so this was a really nice practice to just see how quickly we have access to all of this information.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for sharing that. Really appreciate it. All right. Thank you all for participating and doing a little hands-on here with us. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Tina.
Thanks so much, Mitchell. Okay, so thanks everyone for engaging with the dashboard. This is super exciting to have people poking around. We love hearing feedback about all of the things you're discovering and also the questions that it raises up to you, because again, this is a living product and we like to make sure that we continue to work on it and tailor it to be most useful for users. So as Mitchell just showed us, the dashboard gives you a lot of insights into key trends in community conditions that are related to upward mobility across the board. But then when it comes to identifying and second order tackling the underlying systems that are creating all of those conditions that you see on the ground, the goal of the framework and the metrics is to help you understand what might be the root causes of all of those mobility-related conditions in your community. So to help facilitate that deeper thinking and investigation, we have created and compiled a series of tools and resources that can help users of the data dashboard take their insights from the mobility metrics and dive deeper or turn it into action. So here on this slide, we've illustrated them in these 3 buckets. The first of which are resources related to understanding the upward mobility framework, its background and components. In the middle section here, various resources for using the mobility metrics themselves, as well as incorporating other local data. And then on the right, we have bucketed a bunch of resources for strategies for increasing upward mobility, right? So doing that next step of work. And again, someone asked this in the chat earlier, will these slides be shared out afterwards? Of course they will, along with the recording. So these hyperlinks will all be available to you. But that being said, today I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now and dive a little bit into this middle section, that yellow box that says using the mobility metrics and other local data, to show you where some of those resources live on the Upward Mobility website and how you can use those tools to help inform your understanding of mobility conditions on the ground for your community. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. I hope that's good. Let me know if any technical difficulties. Okay, great. So I'm going to start off at the predictor that Mitchell pointed out in his demonstration earlier, right? So for continuity, let's say you've entered the data dashboard, you're looking at this specific predictor of upward mobility, access to preschool, right? You see that the metric is this share of 3- and 4-year-olds that are enrolled in either nursery school or preschool, but you may be asking yourself some questions, right? Like, I have passing familiarity with the framework, but I'd really love to understand why this specific predictor, why this specific metric, right? And in order to answer some of those questions, we actually have embedded some hyperlinks within the dashboard to drive you to resources that don't exist in the dashboard itself, but exist in our Upward Mobility website, right? Which has a lot of components and resources that are related to all of the data in this dashboard. So you'll notice at the top here, within the data card, there's a hyperlink at the top of the page, and it reads as learn more about this predictor and promising policy interventions, okay? So when you click this, it will actually open up in a separate tab, so you won't lose what you're doing in the data dashboard itself. It will open up what we call the predictor page on our website. So each of the 24 predictors in the framework has one of these subpages on our website, which includes various resources within it. Okay, so at the very top, Mitchell briefly touched on this before. We include evidence on the relationship between this specific predictor and upward mobility outcomes, right? So in case you're asking yourself, why was this specific predictor chosen? What kind of research was considered? Why was this one elevated above other potential predictors of upward mobility? We list out all of the main research that we digested and used in order to make this decision. And we also hyperlink to them so that you can go through and see how it is that this specific predictor is related to specific components of the definition of upward mobility, right? So here we say that it is most directly tied to the economic success component based on all of the research that exists in this section. But of course, the evidence connecting it to upward mobility is not the only thing that you need to know about this predictor. There's very many different things, but we wanted to point to an extra and predictor-specific resource that may be helpful. So if you scroll further down the page, you'll notice that there is a section after the evidence called Promising Local Policy Interventions. So given that you've taken the time to really look into this particular predictor and understand the metric a little bit better, you may be thinking, that's really great, and it's given me maybe an insight that I didn't have before, but what if I need to figure out what to do next and I don't really know where to turn? I really would like to focus on this predictor specifically, but I don't know what to do next. That's why we've compiled this list of promising local policy interventions. Now, of course, this isn't exhaustively comprehensive, but we lift up things that seem to be evidence-based. We also hyperlink to other resources that maybe even further help when it comes to determining what your next steps might be. So for example, in this one, right, the predictor is access to preschool. And the first bullet we have here, it's emphasizing that developing recruitment, training, and retention strategies for building a high-quality workforce for early childhood caregivers may be a really good policy intervention. When you click on this hyperlink, it's actually going to take you to an external resource, right? This is not an urban resource, but this comes from Results from America, right? So they have created what is called the Economic Mobility Catalog. And this is a really excellent resource that is designed specifically to curate a set of strategies, programs, and interventions that evidence across the board shows helps communities achieve better outcomes. And so that's one of many hyperlinks that you will see as you go through the predictor pages. And again, if any questions come up as I'm going through these things, please feel free to keep them coming in the chat. We will do our best to address as many of them as we can during the Q&A section afterwards. So these are the predictor pages. Again, reminding you there's one for each predictor in the framework. Now let's go back to the dashboard itself. Within the dashboard, there's many different entry points, as Mitchell said. There's a lot of different information available to you, but not all of the information is just data. As he briefly touched on at the end, when you scroll to the very bottom of the data dashboard, past all of the data, we have this section that is called Using the Mobility Metrics Data. And this is highlighting 3 really key resources that we've developed that we believe will be helpful for users to further digest the data that exists in the dashboard and then take further steps with it as well. And so these 3 highlighted here, they're called 6 ways to use the mobility metrics right here, how to examine your mobility metrics right here, and obtaining more and local data. Let's start with this first one, right, which is called how to examine your mobility metrics. This essentially is designed as a user guide for anyone who may have variable data literacy, may not know exactly where to start when it comes to analyzing the metric that they're looking at and figuring out what the top line takeaways are from the numbers that they're looking at. So when you click this, it takes you to, again, a page on the Upward Mobility website, which is very connected to the dashboard. And it walks you through, as a user, how you may understand and then further interpret the metric that you're looking at within the dashboard. So at the very top here, we say, are you looking for guidance? Here is an accompanying worksheet. When you click the hyperlink that says worksheet here, it will open up a separate tab that you can either download or print for yourself or use in whatever way is useful for you. And it walks you through a series of steps and then questions to ask yourself in order to better understand the metric that you're looking at in the dashboard. So you'll see here, step 1 is just going ahead and selecting a predictor and then looking at the top line summary statistic that we provide within the data card. And then it will ask you that next order step, like what is standing out to you? Reflect on your knowledge and start doing some comparisons. And so we have several steps throughout the worksheet and multiple questions that lead you to those takeaways so that you can really understand what it is these numbers are and how to interpret them for yourself internally. And again, you may get stuck even with just those questions alone. So we've actually on the page itself included an example of a user walking through one of the data cards using this resource. So here you'll see we have step 1 as well as its accompanying questions. And we do an example analysis here for someone who's either looking at Washington, D.C. or are themselves doing work in Washington, D.C. and how they go ahead and look at the same data card for access to preschool as we've been doing today, and then answer those same questions accordingly. So you have this example to kind of look at and understand how to orient yourself. Now let's go back to the dashboard. And I'm going to start from the dashboard again so you can see how you scroll down to this resource section again. So the dashboard loads and you go all the way down to using the mobility metrics data. Apologies, my internet seems to be a little bit slow. Here we go. It's all loaded. Now, the next resource I want to highlight for you is called 6 Ways to Use the Mobility Metrics. Again, when you click this, it should open up in a separate tab. And this one is just, again, for giving you something to use to orient what is it that I should be taking away with the data that I'm looking at. So let's say you've already examined the number, you understand some basic takeaways. Now you may be thinking, what are some ways for me to use this, right? So this guide is highlighting 6 of them. And of course, there's millions of ways that you can use the metrics, but these are ones that we know are very common based on previous work that we've done with communities interacting with these metrics and the ways in which users have previously interacted with them. They tend to fall in these buckets, right? So these 6 ways are comparing your community with peer communities as well as national averages, then highlighting connections across policies, then revealing disparities within those demographic groups, right? Those breakouts by category that are available within the dashboard. finally prioritizing areas of need, and then setting targeted goals as well as monitoring progress towards those goals. So this webpage just walks you through what each of these might mean or look like. And they are loosely chronological, of course, based on previous work and how users have interacted with the dashboard previously. But again, they're kind of recursive too. You're going to have to jump between based on the type of work and insights that you're getting to. One thing I will highlight here is that for some of them, we try to lift up a community example so that you can ground this in the way other users have had to interact with this specific step in the past. And so that you have this concrete example to compare your own experience against, and you don't feel as though you're just having to come up with it from scratch. Not every single section will have an example, but as more and more users interact with our dash, we will have more and more examples and case studies to point to. So I'll go ahead and close out of that. And I want to lift up this last and third resource that's linked within the dashboard. This one is called Obtaining More Local Data. And so this is for when you've already examined your metric in the dashboard, you have even thought about, all the multiple ways you can use the insights you got from that specific metric or predictor or a series of predictors, right? You may be thinking, listen, this is just not really answering all of the follow-up questions that have been raised by these insights, right? I saw the different category disaggregations. I'm realizing how different populations may be targeted, but I still have a bunch of questions about, how can I determine how this is interacting with my community, which target populations I need to prioritize, and more. So we know that this is inevitable, right? Because the mobility metrics are very much meant to be a starting point. They are not the be-all, end-all of all of this work, right, of upward mobility in your community. So we wanted to create a resource that may be an extra supplemental support for people that are looking for a starting point on where to go to get more answers to all of these questions that they raise, right? So when you click on this one, again, it takes you to our website, but this is a different resource, the Obtaining More Local Data resource, which is this very long repository of all different type of resources that exist online across the internet, right? And these are organized by the pillars and predictors that they are related to within our framework. So if you know, for example, that you want to, again, stick with the predictor that we have been looking at, right, which is access to preschool, we have a filtering option. So you can go ahead and say, listen, just show me all of the data resources in this that are associated with that specific predictor, because that's the one that I have a lot of follow-up questions about. And so that will allow you to isolate it. And then you'll see you have a smaller group of resources to look through, and you can go ahead and click through and see what they describe. One thing I want to raise up here is that beyond just organizing them by the framework components, we also point out the geography at which the data is available at. And the two options are state and local. So the reason we point this out is that a lot of public data resources that exist online are just providing state level averages, but we know, and we've already seen in the chat, frequently people have follow-up questions where they want to get more granular information, right? And so that's why we wanted to highlight when the data resources we found are actually providing something that's a little more localized than those state level numbers. And of course, realistically, a lot of that more granular information is going to exist internally within the departments in your locality or with municipal leaders and organizations on the ground. And so because of that, beyond just these resources, I want to point out that this page also has a section. Here we have why obtain additional data, why it's important to disaggregate. But the one I want to point out is this best practices section, right? Because there's going to be a lot of local data that we are not able to point you to because it exists internally within your locality. And so we raise up these general best practices so that you can then potentially mobilize yourself or ask questions within and around your community to identify further sources of information that can help you answer your questions and determine what mobility conditions look like on the ground. So we point out, beyond census data and government websites, there's going to be open data portals, local libraries and educational institutions, community organizations are going to have their own data repositories, stuff that they collect in your community. And we raise these up so people have this further starting point of where to dig and get more data and insights. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing screen. I have shared a lot of potential resources here. One moment. Stop share. And again, any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And if you really want to follow up on any of these, they all exist on our website. You can click around and find a bunch of really wonderful stuff. And we really want to emphasize that, of course, addressing all of these root causes I keep talking about, it takes more than just data. You know, these data and these tools are just a starting point, of course, but even more resources exist for you online and in person if you just continue to search for them in your community. And we are excited to provide these tools and hear about how you're going to go about planning and exploration with them as well. So let's go ahead and transition into a Q&A section now so we can spend some time answering all these questions that you have been raising up. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start with, I want to mention, of course, feel free to either raise your hand on Zoom or go ahead and come off camera, on camera and off mute in order to share your questions with us, and Mitchell and I will answer them as we go along. But we've been compiling the ones that have come in over time here as well. So I'm going to go ahead and answer. Okay, so here's a question from Matt Sweeney. He said, I'm curious if you considered using an absolute or acceptable threshold for comparison instead of or alongside the national median that you provide, and could you share the reasoning behind choosing the national median as a benchmark? So thank you for your question, Matt. Very good question, and it's certainly not the first time we've gotten that. We actually, for a while, avoided providing a benchmark at all because we believe that each of the components of the framework are very, very context specific. So in order to understand whether something is doing well for your community, you actually need to have a very good understanding of what doing well would mean within your community. And also, realistically, there's no one benchmark across the board that would necessarily mean good versus bad. There's not such an easy binary, unfortunately, for most of these metrics. And they also trend in different directions. But we also knew that users that are looking at these numbers, they can't always immediately figure out what peer community is best to compare themselves to. And so they needed something as like an orienting mechanism to see where they maybe are falling, which is why we provide those histogram distributions so you can kind of see where you fall nationally and also provide that median. But we agree with you that the national median doesn't always necessarily mean good or bad, right? The national median might in fact be very, very low, or unexpectedly like very, very strong and good for that metric. And so realistically, you have to still ask yourself a lot of follow-up questions to determine how well you're doing personally for your community. Okay, I believe Patrick has raised his hand. Feel free to come off mute, Patrick.
Hi there. Mitchell, when you were talking before, you had said exercise caution when comparing city and county. Could you just follow up with that? I work for a city, and I work for a city of about 100,000. But when I look through, there's lots of missing data, so I'm forced to use the county. So I just want to make sure that I'm doing that in an appropriate way.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take a high level stab at it, and then Tina, fill in any gaps here if you feel it's necessary. But yes, like long story short, there are just some differences in the underlying data and the way the metrics are computed. So it's a little bit harder to look at a city compared to a county and have a one-to-one comparison there, right? Because of the differences in the methodology and the underlying analysis to pull these metrics together. And so that's the note of caution. I don't think, I think there are probably times where it's still perfectly useful to contextualize, your city data by comparing to other counties and whatnot. But like Tina said, it really kind of depends on the metric and it depends on some of the ins and outs. The only other thing I would say is that, yeah, for some of these metrics, and this is a theme that we've seen come up in a couple of the questions here, there are some that are available at the county level, but not at the city level at all. So if you do see a case where you're looking for your city level data and it's coming up as missing, looking for the next level up in the geography and looking at the county level, there's a good chance you will find something there. Of course, there is the downside about comparisons, as we mentioned, but it's just a data availability kind of constraint that we've had to kind of do the best we can to give you what we have access to, and then let you know where there's some gaps.
Yeah, no, I think that's a perfect answer, Mitchell. I do want to quickly raise up a question that came through in the chat, which is, what are the major data sources that the dashboard is pulling from? And B, is it possible to export data for a broad range of communities and not just the 6 that you can compare within the tool itself? And so I just want to quickly point to other resources that exist that we just didn't have time to get into in this short presentation. To answer your first question on data sources, so within the dashboard itself, of course, there are table notes and sources that are directly pointed to, and within each of the data cards, But we also have a more exhaustive metrics appendix on our website, which you can find just by Googling or searching within the website itself. For each of the metrics, we break down the source that we've pulled from and aggregated the number from. And then when it comes to the question of exporting the raw data that exists in the dashboard, we actually have a data catalog here at Urban where we provide all of the raw data that populates this dashboard. So you could go ahead and download it and then isolate however many communities you would like to, or use that data to incorporate into your own work as well. I will also mention that all of the code that was used to generate these metrics is publicly available on our GitHub repository, which is also linked on our website as well. We probably have time for like 1 or 2 more questions. Okay, so one came in, why haven't you chosen to roll all the metrics into a composite or single score of upward mobility? That is a very good question, and it's one we get a lot as well. I think it relates to the previous answer I gave, which is that each of these metrics are very nuanced and exist within the context of that policy sphere and that community. So a lot of them are at different levels. So some of them are measuring community level things, some of them are at the family unit level, some of them are individual unit level. And so that makes it very hard to normalize them across all of the metrics in order to roll them up into one upward mobility score. Also, they're not directionally the same, right? Sometimes the number going higher means that your community is trending better. Sometimes the number going lower means your community is trending better, which is also an added complicating factor when it comes to normalizing. Realistically, we could correct for all of this mathematically, but we don't know that it's necessarily useful because you will still have to do a lot of that follow-up work to see why this number looks the way it does, right? You may be very strong in one pillar in your community and very poor in another pillar, which will just look as if you have a neutral upward mobility outcome if we have this big rolled up number. And so we want to more encourage the exploration at the more nuanced level. Oh, Mitchell, they're asking how often this will be updated. Do you want to take that one?
Well, I can answer at least in part in that we are already working on the next update for this. So we've published this just in the last month or so here, but we're hard at work on the first data update that's going to bring some new years of availability, including some more recent statistics as well. And then going forward, we do intend, I believe, to update this as frequently as possible, but I don't know exactly what that cadence is.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Mitchell. There's, these data sources are producing new data at different intervals. We've tried to normalize it as much as possible so that we can do annual updates, and that is our plan as of now. But in the future, we're staying adaptable and we're trying to make sure we give you as contemporaneous of data as we can, as is realistically feasible for our team as well. So definitely stay tuned. I'm sorry if we were not able to get to your question. Thank you so much for your engagement today. But before we run out of time, I just want to again emphasize we really appreciate everyone coming on today and learning about this work. Well, I'll remind you that the resources that we shared are all available on our Upward Mobility Initiative website, and these slides will be posted there as well. You can email us if you have more questions. You can also subscribe to receive updates on future workshops, future events. And finally, before you head out, we ask that you please take a moment to complete our event survey. It's very helpful for us to hear your thoughts and also help shape what we do in the future as well. So with that, if you could click into the survey before you leave, that would be a huge help. You are free to go. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Hi, Tina. If I would like to engage one of your members of your team in joining us in our conference in Atlanta, I work for ULI, and our annual conference is going to take place in February 25th and 26th. We have a panel on home ownership gap that I think this dashboard will really be great to include. Do I contact you directly? Who do you suggest I contact?
Very good question. You can feel free to contact me directly. You can also use our general dashboard email. We monitor that daily as well. So feel free to reach out via any of our emails and we will happily follow up with you. Yeah, this sounds great.
Thank you.